This is the brand new Insta360 Ace Pro 2, a camera that features a whole slate of hardware updates as well as a whole pile of software updates. And I'm going to walk through all those updates and tell you which ones work well and which ones frankly suck. Which, if you're new around here or just simply new to action cam reviews, one of the things you'll probably realize on YouTube is there's a lot of sponsored reviews of these sort of action cameras. This is not a sponsored review. I don't do any sponsored reviews of any products at all. And most notably, I don't let any companies review my review before I hit publish. The point being, Insta360 got a lot of flack earlier this year, and rightfully so, for some of the things they try to do around reviewers. They haven't asked me to do any of those things at all. They just sent me a camera, actually a whole pile of cameras to try out. These are loaner cameras, they go back to them. It's as simple as that. I'm gonna tell you what parts are great on this, what parts are great on the DJI Action 5, what parts are great on the GoPro. And most importantly, I'm gonna tell you the same parts that suck on all three of those cameras. Okay, so getting right into it, I'm gonna talk about hardware stuff first, then I'm gonna talk about software stuff. There are some times where those two intermingle, but we're just gonna get straight into the hardware. The very first thing is they've added a secondary chipset to this. So they've taken the existing Ace Pro 1 chip that was in that camera and put it in this camera. But then they added a second chip next to that to do various tasks from a processing standpoint. In particular, things like denoising, as well as clarity, dynamic range, etc. So the idea being they can do some of these more advanced tasks on a secondary chip that might otherwise not fit on that single chip from a overall processing overhead perspective. Now, the next hardware bit they've done is they've expanded the field of view. My main complaint with the Ace Pro 1 was the fact the field of view was somewhat limited. So they've gone from a max field of view of 151 degrees to 157 degrees. This is really notable when you have a chest mount or something like that, and you want that wider field of view that was a little more restricted on the Ace Pro 1. That said, they noted that GoPro still has a taller field of view than the Insta360 Ace Pro 2 does, meaning that you have a bit more range in GoPro's 8x7 mode as opposed to just the kind of wider diagonal range. Now, the last display or sensor kind of upgrade, if you will, is the display sensor itself. It's still a 1/1.3 inch sensor, but they've upgraded it. They noted this is the exact same sensor that DJI is using in their Action 5 Pro. The difference, though, is that DJI is limiting that to 4K versus Insta360 is going all the way up to 8K. And one of the key things that Insta360 says they're doing is they have a custom firmware on that sensor that allows them more control of the camera in terms of not just the resolution, but also how they process those images. Now, keep in mind, all these big companies have their own custom firmware for these chipsets and sensors, so that's not really that big of a thing, but how they use it is what matters. Oh, hey, and a quick note, if you are finding this video interesting or useful, if you could just watch it all the way through, that's really the only thing the YouTube gods care about these days. It would really help out this video and the channel. Now, we're gonna talk about all of the imaging quality comparison stuff in just a second, because we got a lot to talk about there. But I wanna finish up some of the hardware changes first. This one here, this is a new Windguard. So it's actually removable. You can just simply swap it off like this. It's got a little bit of foam inside there you can kind of barely see. And you can place on there a mic cap as well. Now, most action cameras use 3 microphones to go ahead and do basically wind reduction between those 3 different microphones. And the Insta360 Ace Pro 2 is no different in that regard. You can put the normal mic cap on there and use it just as you normally would. But the idea with the Windguard is it gives you the same thing without having to do it in software, which may give you better results. So here's a quick audio snippet to listen to. Okay, it's a simple audio test. I am behind the camera right now, and the camera, I'm doing about 45 kilometers an hour down this little hill. Okay, it's a simple audio test. I am behind the camera right now, and the camera, I'm doing about 45 kilometers an hour down this little hill. Okay, it's a simple audio test. I am behind the camera right now, and the camera, I'm doing about 45 kilometers an hour down this little hill. Now, if they say you should remove this when you go in the water, you can leave it on just fine in the water. You just need to wait a few hours for this thing to dry out, the foam in there. Oops. To dry out before you expect good microphone quality from that. But I've been using it in the water without any problems and just letting it dry out for a few hours. Or you can just simply put the normal microphone cap on there instead and be off and running. Now, speaking of microphones, they've added USB-C microphone support. This is pretty cool. So, USB-C slot on the side there, you can take off the door like this, no problems, but you can actually stick in there a DJI receiver into this and then do basically wireless audio from your DJI mic, like the one I have right here, into this camera. That's notable because in the past you could do Bluetooth pairing to the camera, no problem. The reason that you want to do native audio from this here is that, one, this has better reception and better transmission and better quality when it's doing it from this to the receiver. And then two, you get multi-channel support. So in this case, I'm using just one microphone, but if I had 2 microphones here, you can only pair one Bluetooth mic at a time, but you can pair 2 of these into the receiver and then into the camera. That's a really nice little touch and something I hope that their competitors also do as well. Next, they've increased the battery capacity of the batteries internally. firmly. These are still the same exact size batteries. They are interchangeable back and forth, but they've gone from 1650 milliamp hours to 1800 milliamp hours. Now, I have had a couple issues swapping back and forth where the camera simply doesn't turn on. You have to press it a few more times to turn on when using batteries from the opposite camera. Insta360 says they're looking into it, but it shouldn't be happening. Now with this, they've also added the ability in the Ace Pro 2 to do reverse charging. So you can take this USB-C port on the side right there, and you can go ahead and charge your phone with it or whatever you want. And 1800 milliamp hours for this battery, you could basically charge your entire phone on it. So that's a pretty cool little feature. And then there's some improvements on the screen as well. Number one, they've increased the number of hinge opens that it's certified to 50,000 hinge opens, opening, closing over it again, from 25,000 previously. Just for some napkin math on what that means per day, if you did this every single day, 34 times a day, that would be 4 years worth. I would say that as cool as this is, I use it like once per day, which probably is one of the most notable downsides of this camera, is that this front screen right there is just for status only. It's not to show you all the imagery. Now in theory, that's the pop-up screen there, and that's cool because I like this much bigger screen for certain scenarios, but in a lot of action type scenarios, pulling the screen up, especially with gloves and stuff like that, is pretty cumbersome. So I'm hit or miss. I wish I had both, to be honest. I wish I could have like a normal little GoPro or Action 5 screen on the front there, which shows me what I'm doing for certain action scenarios. And then when I want the big screen, I wish I could pull it up like this and see that. Maybe for an Ace Pro 3? Nonetheless, they've also increased the size of this from 2.4 inches to 2.5 inches. They've increased the pixel density by 70%, and they've increased the brightness by 6%. Okay, so let's talk about some of those software things that are being bumped up due to those hardware increases. The first big one is they've increased the 8K frames per second from 24 frames per second to 30 frames per second. Now, that's probably a big deal just in terms of conforming to other footage, but overall, Insta360 themselves says you really shouldn't be using 8K in their action cameras for, well, action. It's really for scene type things where you then want to crop into it. So here's a good example overlooking this beach area where I've got the 8K footage, and then in post I'm cropping into it to still have a 4K footage and still look really, really sharp. Versus if I do the same thing on DJI's Action 5, it's only a 4K image, so it's going to look a little more muddled once I crop into it. In the case of GoPro, you start off with a 5.3K image, so you're sort of splitting the difference there a bit. But from an action standpoint, let's look side by side between 4K and 8K images. You're going to see a lot more artifacting on that 8K image than you would expect to see, but you do still get more detail out of it. Let me just pause right here while I'm running with my wife and note the butterfly. Like for a 1 or 2 frame thing, the butterfly came across there. In the 4K image, it looks just kind of like a fuzzy thing. In the 8K image, you can see details of that butterfly. Also notice the individual hair strands that you can't see that well in the 4K, but you can in the 8K. So there are scenarios to use the 8K side of it. For the most part though, you're probably going to be in 4K. Okay, sorry for the slight change of view. I had to move the camera because I was getting baked by the sun. Now the next change they've made is they've increased the low light footage from 30 frames per second into 60 frames per second. Both Insta360 and DJI have dedicated low light modes that make the images look really good, like frankly really, really good, especially compared to a GoPro, which has no dedicated low light video mode. And now with Insta360, you can do that at 60 frames per second as opposed to 30 frames per second. Here's some footage side by side I shot at night, and you can see very clearly DJI Insta360 are well beyond GoPro from a night scenario at this point in their latest cameras. I would say side by side, Insta360 is generally speaking doing a better job at reproducing the scene as it is. A couple things you'll probably notice: it retains the details better versus DJI seems to kind of like brush them out a little bit at night, especially when there's lighting on that. DJI also artificially increases the brightness in certain areas that just simply isn't reality. But there are still cases where DJI is doing it better. So the scene with the bridge right there, the lower half of that scene, Insta360 takes the cake. That is correct in terms of what that looks like in real life. But in the upper half of the scene, the Insta360 is adding way too much brightness in the sky that just simply does not exist there in real life. Now, as I've said before, don't necessarily buy an action camera for night footage that some YouTuber shows you. Buy it for the scenarios you're using it for. If you're mainly shooting at night, then go forth and buy an action camera based on night footage. But if you're mainly shooting in the daytime, then buy an action camera based on its daytime footage, because those are drastically different, as you're going to see in just a second. So the next change that Insta360's made is they've added active HDR to 60 frames per second as well. So this means that you can get 30 frames or 60 frames per second. It is on by default across the board for all of the 4K stuff. So now you have it on both. It's notable that you can also turn it off if you want to. In the case of DJI, you can't turn that off. Now, looking at some daytime footage here side by side across these three cameras. Overall, I feel like GoPro does a better job at reproducing the colors and the overall scene feel in terms of how it looks in real life compared to DJI or Insta360. Again, keeping in mind, DJI and Insta360 are using the same sensor. So there's going to be some underlying pieces here that are going to be very similar between those two cameras, even though they have different processing pipelines above that. I feel like time and time again, the colors on the GoPro for daytime footage anyways are more true to real life, versus the colors on Insta360 and DJI tend to be a bit more popped, and they don't necessarily be as close to reality as I see with my eyes. Sometimes you might prefer that pop to it, but it's not necessarily reality. And one of the best examples of that is underwater mode. So the Ace Pro 2 has a new underwater mode in it, and the idea being is to make the colors correct for underwater usage. So here's the three cameras side by side, including the Action 5 and its ability to show depth gauge stuff underwater, which is super cool, by the way. But when it comes to reproducing this scene, at first you're like, oh yeah, Insta360 and DJI look good. But as my wife swims by, let me just pause right here. You'll notice all of a sudden DJI and Insta360 look really dark on her skin, especially her shoulders and near her head. Keeping in mind, the sun is behind me. Bright midday sun shot at 1 o'clock, the brightest point of the day with no clouds whatsoever and only a couple meters below the surface. The GoPro here from a brightness standpoint is very close to the actual brightness underwater that I was seeing at that point in time. I would say some of the highlights are maybe a little bit too bright there, but I'd rather have those slightly bright highlights than the camera's adding way too much darkness onto her body there. It's even worse if you look at this selfie little video snippet we did right there, where you can't even see in her goggles at all. Look at DJI, they completely black out her eyes from a goggle standpoint. Insta360 is like halfway. This is a completely clear and transparent glass. There's no tinting whatsoever there, and you can see that very clearly in GoPro, but not in the DJI side of it. Now, the last little snippet underwater is more of like a stylistic choice. This is a much wider shot, and both Insta360 and DJI are darkening the image way more than it is in real life, but I could see how if you were posting these three to Instagram, you would probably choose the Insta360 or the DJI from a look standpoint, but that's a stylistic choice that isn't actually rendering back that scene correctly. And that's something that's really important. Again, going back to my point of different paths that these different camera companies are choosing when you look at the footage. Now, we've got a bunch of other like minor things that we got to walk through really quickly here. I'm just going to go hit list style because this video is getting way too long. They've added a new Mega View. Mega View basically takes their ultra wide view and then kind of blends it with linear, so you have a little less distortion or fisheye look on the edges. Next, they've added a new endurance battery mode. What this does for 4K 30 and only 4K 30 is it turns off wind reduction and it basically reduces your stabilization. So the idea being, if you've got it on a tripod like it is right now, this is perfect for that because it reduces the overall demands of the camera and gives you 50% more battery life. It's something that we've seen other companies experiment with, but I think the naming and how they're structuring it here makes a lot of sense. Next, they've added a log video profile, so you can now shoot in log. The only downside though is it's still 8-bit log and not 10-bit log, so that's going to be a bit of disappointment for some, You're welcome. For some people, I'll put a little 8-bit snippet in the Dropbox share or something down there in case you want to poke at it. Next, they've added an in-camera horizon lock. What that allows you to do is to take your camera like this, rotate it around, and then have the entire horizon stay level the whole time. Next, they've increased the stills from 48 megapixels to 50 megapixels. Here's two photos side by side. I don't notice any difference at all. They've also added timecode support. So now if you have multiple Ace Pro 2s, you can sync them all together using a timecode generator or using the app and have all of them on the same timecode. So that's useful for larger productions that may have a bunch of these cameras. After that, they've added a dash cam mode. So you can go onto the camera and you can have it where it automatically starts recording when power is applied. So if you had wired the camera into your car, as soon as you turn on your car, power is applied, it starts recording. You can change whatever settings you want within that. You can even choose how much storage of your SD card to use for the dash cam portion and just rewrite over that when it reaches the end of its storage. And then when you turn off your car and the power is cut, it'll automatically stop recording. They've also increased the pre-recording option, so you can go up to 90 seconds for 1080p and 120 seconds for 4K. That's compared to roughly 30 seconds for their competitors. So that's pretty cool. And then last but not least, And last but not least, for my sports kind of realm here, they've added the ability to use your phone to go ahead and overlay data metrics onto the camera. So let me explain how this works. Up until now, Insta360's had the ability to use a little remote control that has GPS in it that shows things like speed and acceleration and whatnot. And then last year, they added the ability to use your watch. So you can use a Garmin watch or an Apple Watch or a Coros bike computer and other devices out there to overlay that data automatically onto your videos. It is super slick, by far the best implementation of that today, where it just automatically happens in the background. You don't have to like manually deal with files or anything like that. Now though, on your phone, you can use the Insta360 app and record your activity in the same way that you might with Strava or something like that, and pull that data in for speed and distance and GPS data and stuff like that. Again, a really nice little touch there for those that don't have a compatible GPS device of some sort. Okay, so where do we stand overall on this camera? Well, I'll probably do a separate camera comparison video comparing the three main cameras that we talked about all video long. But in terms of this camera release, one of the things Insta360's clearly done here is add a lot of useful and practical features. Stuff like reverse charging. So if you're out on some adventure and you've got an extra Insta360 battery, but your phone's almost dead, you can just simply charge your phone with that extra battery. Like that's cool stuff, right? Sure, there are the headline features like the 8K30 stuff and bits like that. I don't think the 8K30 is all that useful. That is a marketing feature and even Insta360 will basically admit that's mostly a marketing feature more than a practical feature. But they are using that 8K sensor size to be able to do things that is practically useful. So if you wanted to use that 8K footage for scenery, landscapes, and stuff like that, that's great. That's a totally usable, very functional, very good use of that sensor size. If you want to use it for 8K action, I think you're probably going to be a bit disappointed. But you have the flexibility to do it there, something their competitors don't. I do wish though that Insta360 would add some more resolution options like we see on a GoPro with the 5.3K and stuff like that in between. That 5.3K footage is double that of 4K and much more usable in a daily workflow perspective than the 8K footage. So finding some middle ground there would have been great. Still, with some of the other practical upgrades like the increase in the field of view, this is the first time the Ace Pro 2 can become a viable option as my daily driver for an action camera, where I previously had to go to GoPro for both that wider field of view as well as the better daytime video quality. Whereas now we're at a point between this and some of the sports features like pulling in the watch data and stuff like that, I'm probably going to be using the Insta360 Ace Pro 2 a heck of a lot more than some of the other action cameras on the market. I think it's a very clear signal to GoPro that just having the best daytime image quality is no longer going to be good enough for a lot of people. They want a lot more of the practical stuff day to day, whether it's fast battery charging or some of the data overlays or all the other things I've just talked about over the last 20 minutes. Those are things that people want to see in a GoPro, and their competitors are passing them by with just more practical day-to-day features. Anyways, with that, hopefully you found this video interesting or useful. If so, give it a like at the bottom or subscribe for plenty more sports technology goodness. Have a good one.